Okay, this is Elle speaking. We are here to go over a recent pediatric reclassification paper for hypermobile EDS. I'll do a visual
and,
description. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
and HSD,
Oh,
hypermobility disorders. It's all of it together.
right, the HSD. Um, yep. We're going to go over this terrible paper. I am a tall, thin, white hypermobile person, short brown hair, longer on one side. I'm wearing big over-the-ear headphones, tinted glasses, long blue earrings, a green choker, a blue and green necklace, and a green shirt. My background is half orange and half white. It's a tabletop counter behind me. Um, my pronouns are they, them.
Cool. And I'm Audrey, and I am, I don't remember if you said you work for Hyp-ACCESS or not, but I do work for, we work for Hyp-ACCESS.
I feel like people are going to figure that one out.
Um, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm a very average height, thin, kind of olive toned white, hypermobile person. I have red lipstick and my half blonde, half brown hair is up in a clip. I'm wearing a white shirt with a red collar that matches my lipstick. And behind me, I'm kind of backlit. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of like windows and sliding doors and concrete behind me. Yeah, so we are going to go through a paper pretty extensively. We have, notes and things, and we're gonna hit on as much of it as we can. This is really from a critical analysis that we have developed at Hyp-ACCESS. We have an internal research tracking system, so we were alerted of this very early, right when it came out. We know that a lot of folks actually didn't even know that it came out until we mentioned it. And like all reclassifications may go, this might foreshadow a reclassification for adults that may be coming out soon. But we're gonna go through this one now. Anything else, Elle, before we?
I don't think so. I mean, we'll really get into it, but it's another reclassification that's going to do enormous amounts of harm to hypermobile people. Really bad data, really, really clear underlying agendas once we start kind of looking at how they're using their supposed data. Um, you're going to share your screen?
I think so. We're gonna try a thing. We're gonna try a thing. It may not be great. But we'll switch it if it doesn't work. Oh, I was looking at confidence intervals. All right, great. And then realized I was misreading the numbers. Okay. So the paper that we're going through was published this year, and I actually don't even have the date that we saw that it was published, but it was last month sometime. And it was published in the Orphanet Journal of Rare Diseases. So right there, that's a flag. We're talking about conditions and diagnoses that are not rare. Data has shown that they're absolutely not rare. And this is published in the Orphanet Journal of Rare Diseases. The type of paper is it's supposedly called a review. And a review paper usually kind of looks at metadata. It looks at meta-analyses. It looks at kind of the whole of scientific information that is peer-reviewed and published, and it reviews, either a topic of literature or a subtopic of that literature. To call this paper a review is a hard sell for us. We'll get into that as to why. It's an interesting tactic, but it is absolutely not a review. And we'll even get into the citations and explore the citations that are used in this paper. The title is Pediatric Joint Hypermobility, a Diagnostic Framework and Narrative Review. So right there, it's a new diagnostic framework And I think by narrative review, we've speculated a bit about this, that maybe they're calling it a narrative review because it's their version of the story. But it's a hard sell for a review. Elle, any other notes on that before we move on?
I mean, we want to note who's on it. There's a lot of big names on there that are behind all the classifications that come out usually. I cannot quite, is there any way we can make it bigger or get rid of the screen preview on the left?
Yeah, let me see. Sorry, I'm using a PDF tool. There we go. Is that better?
Yeah, that is better.
Okay.
That is better. So the first researcher is actually Top, who is on one of the kind of central citations from research over a decade ago that was taking quite a different slant. Then we've got Jane Simmons, who appears on lots of things, Raoul Engelbert, Brad Tinkle, who's on pretty much everything, and Alan Hakim, who is the correspondent listed for this paper and is on pretty much everything. And as we'll talk about more, it's all the same people making the decisions and just citing their friends or their colleagues in this insular genetic research and EDS world.
Yeah, or their, closed door meetings. They cite those too, which is kind of
We'll get there.
So we're first going to just read the whole abstract and probably pause after a few things. What the screen currently is an annotated version of the PDF of this paper, and this is something that Audrey, annotated. And there's other things we will want to say.
And we will make sure when we post this that we're linking to the paper so folks can review it themselves. It is open access, as well as linking probably to the audio only version of this recording.
Okay, great. So we are going to read the abstract. Elle, shall I begin?
Take it away.
Right. So an abstract is the overall summary of the paper. And they organize the abstract into background, observations, conclusions, and keywords. So you'll immediately notice that there's no methods here. They're not actually collecting any data. They're using the term observations instead of any kind of analysis. So they're also not doing any analysis on other data that exists, which is normally what we would potentially see brought up more in a review, where they would be, summarizing analyses of many different publications. So, background. Hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or hEDS, and hypermobility spectrum disorders, or HSD, are debilitating conditions. True. Diagnosis is currently clinical in the absence of biomarkers, and criteria developed for adults are difficult to use in children and biologically immature adolescents. So there's a lot to say here. We're going to get into it more as we go through the paper. I underlined biologically immature adolescents because once you get into the rabbit hole of what is biologic maturity, especially when we're talking about a group of people that experience variations of what biologic maturity looks like far and wide. So the statement, using it as a statement as like we know that this is biologic maturity and this is not, that's also a hard sell. Elle, do you have anything else you want to add to that before we?
I think we'll talk about biologic maturity when it comes up more later.
Okay. Generalized joint hypermobility, or GJH, they change this all the time. We will say, though, now it seems that there is a consensus that it is generalized joint hypermobility, or GJH, and that consensus has seemed to come up in the past, year and a half, in my observations at least. So the abstract says generalized joint hypermobility, or GJH is a prerequisite for hEDS and generalized HSD. Now, generalized HSD is actually a sub-diagnosis in this new classification that they name in this paper. This is not anything that existed before. So it's kind of interesting that they're using what they're making up right now as kind of a part of the background, even though it's just really what they're making up right now in this paper.
They definitely do that to interrupt, but when they did create some categories for HSD years ago, there was a localized versus generalized that they used.
And in their recent conference about HSD, they had some HSD conference or something like that. That was actually the first time we'd seen the subcategories were in the descriptions of their conference topics, and then also a posting on Instagram publicly that was last year.
Yeah, they definitely didn't center them to start out with because they were just creating HSD with that 2017 reclassification.
Yeah. So back to the actual words. Current literature identifies a large proportion of children as hypermobile using a Baton score of greater than or equal to 4 or 5 out of 9, which is the cutoff for generalized joint hypermobility in adults. Other phenotypic features from the 2017 hEDS criteria can arise over time. What phenotypic features? Okay. Finally, many comorbidities described in hEDS, HSD are also seen in the general pediatric and adolescent population. That's a
Maybe they're seen in the generalized population because this disability is so common.
Yeah. So yeah, that statement really opens a can of worms and really relates to a lot of the citations that they're using, which they're using in their own way to paint their own picture. Therefore, pediatric specific criteria are needed. So they're basically saying that because, we have to be able to identify generalized joint hypermobility, and, it's like hard to decide how common it is in kids. And that data is kind of all over the place. And like maybe the phenotypic features develop over time. They're not born with them, which is an interesting assumption as well. They basically are like, we need pediatric specific criteria because of these things, even though the Baton doesn't perform well in adult populations either, and doesn't really separate anyone by level of severity. So that's another hard sell for me. The last sentence in this first paragraph of the background that is highlighted in yellow. The pediatric working group of the International Consortium on EDS and HSD, which is really the people who wrote this, has developed a pediatric diagnostic framework presented here. Okay, so this paper is actually a pediatric diagnostic framework that they are currently presenting to us, not a review. All right, let's get that straight. The last sentence, the work was informed by a review of the published evidence. Elle and I spent quite a lot of time looking into all of their citations, and I wouldn't say this was a review of the published evidence. I think it's very clever that they say the work was informed. They're clearly to some degree acknowledging that they're not really looking at any data, that it was informed, right? That's not the final say, it was just informed. And the published evidence they review is specific in particular. Can you read the observations, Elle, or should I keep reading?
Sure, I can read the observation.
Okay.
Yeah, so to start off the observations in the abstract highlighted in purple here by Audrey, the framework has 4 components: generalized joint hypermobility, skin and tissue abnormalities, musculoskeletal complications, and core comorbidities. So we're going to talk about these all more. This is how they're segmenting up the proposed diagnostic to try to scale things from mild or asymptomatic to more severe. And they're really not using data, as usual. They continue to say a Baton score of greater than or equal to 6 out of 9 best identifies children with generalized joint hypermobility at 2 standard deviations above average, based on published general population data.
Can we pause there for a second, Al?
Mm-hmm.
I'm now realizing that they put this in the abstract. I didn't put this together until now. That statement is based on 2 studies that they specifically cite that apply a bell curve to a population whose data we don't have. And the populations that they're even applying this bell curve to, they're basically just saying, oh, everyone within the middle 90% is normal. And if you're at the top 5%, you're not normal, even though they're not looking at abnormalities or impacts in quality of life at all in these studies. They're just kind of deciding that everything should fit along a bell curve. And then when they actually look at the, means of Baton scores kind of across all of their data points, it's absolutely not a bell curve. Like so it's interesting to me that they're making this statement as if it's really conclusive, and the recommendation of 6 out of 9 only comes from like one paper who showed that like young girls in particular within a certain age range, they wanted to increase it to 6 out of 9. So it's interesting to me also that they're saying children generally up to age 18, when the data that they're specifically referencing in this point, even though it's not cited, is only recommending an increase in that Baton score for a specific age group of a specific like subpopulation that's impacted. So there's another huge generalization. Anyway.
Yeah, indeed. This is one of many examples throughout this paper where they are both cherry picking and warping data or warping published research to serve their agenda of narrowing this population further and further and further, and denying what is common when it comes to hypermobile disability. So they continue. Skin and soft tissue changes include soft skin, stretchy skin, atrophic scars, stretch marks, I don't even know how to pronounce this guy, pypsogenic papules, and recurrent hernias. And highlighted in yellow, 2 symptomatic groups were agreed, musculoskeletal and systemic. So their group that got together, this pediatric working group of the International Consortium that was behind the 2017 reclassification, is just making a decision that they're going to separate things into musculoskeletal and systemic, as if not all hypermobility is systemic. They say that emerging comorbid relationships are discussed. And highlighted in yellow, this framework generates 8 subgroups: 4 pediatric generalized joint hypermobility and 4 pediatric generalized hypermobility spectrum disorder. So they're separating what they used to call benign, again, from what is now a hypermobility spectrum disorder, which they're just further and further pushing things into that benign or asymptomatic non-systemic category. And then underlined, they continue, hEDS is reserved for biologically mature adolescents who meet the 2017 criteria, which also covers even rarer types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome at any age.
So, first of all, let's go back to the fact that the title of this paragraph is called observations. These are not observations. These are cherry-picked and warped data, like to kind of to a point where I'm like, ooh, that's a stretch. There's still a very large focus of skin and soft tissue changes when we know that in hEDS and HSD, which are the same thing, that is often not as apparent, and yet it is still very central, this aesthetic idea of what hypermobility is supposed to look like systemically. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but the fact that someone has to have recurrent hernias as a child is horrific to me, before anyone would be considered for a symptomatic, quote unquote, version of these syndromes, even though this is tough. The idea that you can separate musculoskeletal from systemic, I'm sorry, you just can't ultimately when we're talking about connective tissue, because connective tissue connects the muscle fibers to every other system.
No, you really can't. But it's a continued tactic they've used to separate people away from a diagnosis that could actually provide systemic care. We saw that happen with hEDS and HSD. They separate out HSD. HSD was seen as musculoskeletal. Only physical therapy was recommended. None of the comorbidities were even assessed or acknowledged. And now they're doing that with HSD. They're separating out further so that some HSD is real and considered worthy of care, and other is just this common, we're going to ignore it thing, like it has always been with the common hypermobility.
And the fact that there are 8 subgroups of diagnostics before we even get to the possibility of being diagnosed with hEDS is mind-blowing. So they're basically saying that as a child under age 18, you no longer can get an hEDS diagnosis. It does not exist. They are now saying you are going to be in one of these subgroups of essentially HSD, but they're trying to group it as HSD and then this other form of HSD, which is really just pediatric generalized joint hypermobility, as if they're separate. So it becomes extremely complex very quickly with very little justification to back it up. And I don't know who, after reading this paper, would ever be interested in diagnosing children with this. And we'll go through as to why. Yeah, any last thoughts on that before I go to the conclusions of this abstract?
I mean, yeah, we should move on, but it's incredibly confusing, and we don't think that that is a mistake, because it allows them to do their own insular research while kind of the rest of the world and medical professionals who are not in that insider circle end up throwing up their hands or being too confused to actually assess, diagnose, and treat hypermobile people.
Right. So the conclusions of this abstract: this framework allows hypermobile children to be categorized. What a beginning sentence. This framework allows hypermobile children to be categorized into a group describing their phenotypic and symptomatic presentation.
You want to quick explain what phenotype means?
Sure. So phenotype is essentially what how traits manifest physically, right? So there's some kind of genetic component. There's all these other layers of how, genes are then interpreted and proteins are built off of them. So it's not like genotype to phenotype as directly as everyone wants it to be, including the EDS Society, for real. And so a phenotype is just what that manifestation looks like. So blue eyes, brown eyes are a phenotype, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is
be like how hypermobility looks physically,
mm-hmm. Or maybe what it presents with systemically. This is one of the first signs of this conclusion is really what they're trying to do. They're trying to narrow the population to find what they think will be a phenotype with biomarkers, because they think that if they keep narrowing people and cutting out people who they arbitrarily think are less symptomatic, then they will find something. And they may even be working from insider data.
They likely are. But the other part of that is, there's no acknowledgement that a lot of the way these comorbidities are even recognized is related to like changes in biomarkers rather than these like wild out of quote unquote normal ranges. So the idea that just narrowing a population rather than actually rethinking how we're even maybe taking data or how frequently we do labs and look at changes over time, there's other ways to find biomarkers that actually would be cheaper and would give us more information about how these systemic things manifest.
Sure. Yes, but it wouldn't be genetic factors that could, hopefully eliminate the disability.
Right. So then in their conclusion, I underline, it clarifies, it does not clarify whatsoever, the recommendation that comorbidities should be defined using their current internationally accepted frameworks. So they basically are also now saying, we as the EDS consortium, or however we want to call ourselves, what day of the week it is, because it always depends on what day of the week it is for what they want to call themselves. We also don't really want to deal with any of these comorbidities. They don't want to deal with the diagnostics and how they're different in people with connective tissue syndromes compared to other things. They don't want to deal with the reality that, care access is way harder because biomarkers for those are often not as frequently shown in people with connective tissue syndromes than other people, and on and on and on. So they're basically just absolving accountability for those.
Yeah. As always, absolving that accountability for care and just continuing with their own research agendas.
Right.
Okay.
And they say that it provides a foundation for improving clinical care and research quality in this population, which I quickly follow with a very large word that says bullshit in a red rectangle, because this does not clarify or improve clinical care whatsoever. It's actually gonna do the very opposite in a really, really harmful way. So I'm gonna scroll. So in their introduction, they're summarizing the 2017 criteria based on expert consensus, which is similar to what's happening here. Of course, they say evidence from adult studies, but that's a hard sell again.
And there's no citation, right?
No, there's no citation. They talk about what the diagnosis of hEDS requires in relation especially to the Baton score specifically. Like they're really talking about generalized joint hypermobility here. They bring back in marfanoid habitus a little bit more central than they had in the past. Elle, do you want to talk about this?
Sure. Yeah, so marfanoid habitus is not included in the actual 2017 hEDS checklist that is supposed to be the thing that physicians used. It is mentioned in the papers that reclassify EDS and create HSD in 2017 with some of these same people on them, Castori for sure. And those ones mention marfanoid habitus, but mainly in relation to other types of EDS, and of course, to ruling out Marfans. But it's interesting that they brought it back in, and signifies to us that they've decided that the phenotype they're looking for and trying to narrow for to find some genetic factors, maybe that's something that they're trying to use to do that.
Yeah. So they say that HSD is currently described in individuals with any of generalized peripheral, which is hands or feet, localized, which is any single joint, or historic joint hypermobility and associated symptoms in the absence of other cause/diagnosis. So, they're just making this up. The generalized, peripheral, localized, and historic, that's not something that has been used diagnostically. It's not something that child studies show, oh, this is how we're going to group these different categories, is by, different ways they meet or do not meet the Baton score. The Baton score has not shown to be useful as a tool for measuring the hypermobility or the kind of impact of hypermobility on somebody's life. So already the premise that we're working on is kind of made up. I don't know how else to say it. And their whole thing about in the absence of other cause and diagnosis, and we're going to get into this more, is really horrible here, because it just is going to cut so many people out of care if they aren't allowed to actually be, you know, see a specialist that knows how to diagnose this, which after reading this paper, I don't know how you would. So it essentially just puts up so many care barriers. And then what I have highlighted in purple here, you know, they talk about this idea of biologic maturity, and that biologically mature adolescents can be diagnosed using these criteria, but they're difficult to use in children and biologically immature adolescents. And they're saying, you know, we're just going to group them with children who have not yet developed a stable phenotype. There is no such thing as a stable phenotype when we're talking about hypermobility and hypermobile conditions. Right, Al? Like, I don't know what that means.
It means something that fits into their diagnostic parameters they want to use for their research. Yeah, everything we know about the spectrum of hypermobile conditions indicates that so many factors influence symptom sets. It is not just straightforward, clear-cut genetics. And they would have found a gene a long time ago if it was. This is genetic mosaicism, as Audrey, you often talk about.
Right.
Many factors coming together, including environment and development, of course, but kids are sick.
Right.
They're not just asymptomatic.
No, and it's really interesting how they think that biologic maturity, whatever the F that even means, I mean, truly, especially when we're talking about hypermobile connective tissues, you know, folks on the intersex spectrum often present with hypermobility too, and all of these conditions. And so it's not separate. So this idea that biologic maturity within this population is something that we can identify and know and measure. Actually, this population is extremely complex when we're talking about biologic maturity, especially if they're folks who have had you know, non-consensual surgeries. So it's really harmful to intersex people, and it's really harmful to people who might not aesthetically meet the idea of what biologic maturity is. So I'm going to scroll down a tiny bit. So they cite some papers in this first section, right, Al? I'm scrolling up a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And these are some of the only like real research that they're citing. Everything else is like a citation from like a conference they had, or like a meeting they had, or something like that, right, Al? Isn't that?
Yeah, I was looking at notes to try to see what the citations are. Could you say that one more time?
That the only like real citations of peer-reviewed papers are some of these first ones. I think it's like one.
Yeah, 3, 4, 5 are real
3, 4,
papers
5,
here.
and 10, right?
And 10, yeah.
Okay.
It's once we get into methods that those are citations, they're making them up. But here in where they're talking about kind of how joint hypermobility has been observed in children, the citations 3 and 4 are things they're characterizing as essentially incidental. They're saying that hypermobility is really common in children, but it isn't symptomatic. It isn't a disability. It isn't a disorder.
Well, but what's interesting about these two papers, 3 and 4, is they're actually not even willing to say that these kids are asymptomatic. They say these kids are healthy, but they do a lot of sports, and funny enough, the level of hypermobility actually really correlates with the amount of physical activity the kids are doing. But these papers aren't looking at health history. They're not asking these kids, are you in pain? They're not asking questions about quality of life, or kind of potentially uncovering the reality that they are symptomatic. They're really just looking at all of these kids, what's their Baton score? How old are they? What's their, you know, supposed gender? What's their supposed, you know, race? And their race categories, of course, are Caucasian and non-Caucasian, not joking. And they really underrepresent non-Caucasian populations in the studies, which is not okay, because we know that they're actually overrepresented in terms of who hypermobility actually impacts. So then when we look at their conclusions, we're like, well, you know, your sample is not even really accurate. So, you know, and they exclude kids with hypermobility who have any kinds of problems that hypermobility may cause. So they're only looking at a certain kind of folks with hypermobility, and they're not actually asking any questions about, do you have chronic pain? And then they're saying, well, this is just the normal amount of hypermobility in a population.
Mm-hmm. And the authors of this paper are definitely using the citations that way. They're saying that hypermobility is common in children, but, you know, it's just hypermobility. It isn't syndromic. It isn't systemic. It isn't, you know, in need of care. And then they cite 5, which is an old paper by the first author on this paper, Toss, right?
Yes.
That is looking more at what they're considering symptomatic hypermobility. Which one of these used the bell curve?
I want to say it was 4, but it could have been 3. I think it was actually 4. I think 3, the premise was just, these people are normal because they're at age 14 were considered healthy by both themselves and their parents. They were in this long longitudinal study for this other cohort. This is just like a data pool that these people pulled information from, and then asked, you know,
right.
all of the participants who had been in that study, will you come back and do the Baton score?
Yeah.
And so ended up making their pool very biased, you know, in terms of like what demographics actually showed up.
Yeah. All these pools are incredibly biased, and they're using these here to say that it's difficult to distinguish between what is a normal physical trait according to them and what is an underlying disorder according to them, which is justifying them making this criteria.
Even
But
though what that data actually shows is that the Baton score is like not a good measure of severity of problems or hypermobility generally. And these papers really won't go as far to say like, this is the normal distribution of hypermobility.
right.
So
they are showing it's incredibly common. That's
right.
that's a factor in pretty much any population study having to do with hypermobility, because it is common.
And these samples, of course, are overrepresenting white people and affluent white people. And so their data and their findings directly contradict findings in populations of primarily people of color. So we also just kind of want to name, like, when you're cherry picking data like this, and this you know, these specific studies that you're citing underrepresent the people who are way more impacted more frequently, and you're not citing the studies on populations of people of color who are more impacted at all, that because they contradict, you know, their findings contradict. I mean, it's really racist. I don't, you know, this is a racist choice. And this is something they consistently do, is they ignore population data from populations of color, particularly poor populations of color.
Mm-hmm. And they'll like say something in their paper about how higher prevalence has been found, but make up in some of these papers, they cite incredibly racist justifications as to why that is, including that citation 10. They say that it's they say that it's less common in European people, essentially because they live a healthier lifestyle. So that's just pure racism.
Also, like, who gets access to healthcare? You know, I mean, it brings up so many questions about all of this. Sorry, go on, Elle.
go through a couple highlights here. So they're also saying that musculoskeletal complications and comorbidities can occur in any child, as though those things occurring are, again, those incidental anomalies. It's just like all children can have
Well,
musculoskeletal complications, comorbidities. So, it isn't statistically significant for hypermobility.
which is wild because it absolutely is. And a lot of, and the way that they're actually using data to make this statement, and I see this happen actually quite a bit as a tactic. So a lot of times, when we talk about hypermobility and the spectrum of hypermobility, we're talking about a lot of different diagnoses that can exist together and experiences that do exist together, right? They're not actually separate things. So a lot of the research that comes out is like, oh, this paper is associating hypermobility with POTS, let's say. And then another paper comes out. This paper is associating hypermobility with irritable bowel syndrome. Okay, great. And then another paper comes out. This paper is associating irritable bowel syndrome with POTS, right? So it's not that each paper can associate all of the variables at once. We have to look at kind of what are all of the associations and what is the map of associations. But the way that they use that data is they say, well, because those populations were not diagnosed with EDS, they're not associated. And that means that these complications can occur in any child without the presence of a connective tissue difference.
Yeah, with no acknowledgement that they're making it impossible to get diagnosed with EDS.
Right. So they're trying to like disassociate the associations to be able to say, there's justification in how we're categorizing people, even though it's not really based in any data, and we're truly warping data. I want to go back to citation 5 really quick, because that was the Tufts paper and it was published in 2009. It actually had a really interesting thesis. It was a review of all of the literature that in the title said like generalized joint hypermobility or different versions of that. This was when benign joint hypermobility was really common. And the paper actually had a bent of, why are we only saving the diagnosis of generalized joint hypermobility for people with EDS, because there's all these other people with disorders of heritable connective tissue disorders, who also have the same physical problems because they're connective tissue differences. And so this diagnosis should actually be used on a wider population of patients with varying genetic, underlying genetic features, because they have the exact same struggles as people with EDS in that way. And yeah, we've never really seen that paper used before by these people until now. And then, the bent of that paper is quite interesting. And then this person is the first author on this current reclassification. So clearly she was let into the golden gates and her position has now changed. I'm going to scroll down if that's okay.
Okay. Their proposal.
So they proposed that children should not be assessed with the 2017 criteria or diagnosed with hEDS until they have reached biological maturity. So a pediatric specific framework was developed. So they're like basically making a statement. They're like, we propose that they shouldn't be diagnosed. So that's why we did this. And it's like, but you're just saying the same thing twice. You know what I mean? And they say that the diagnoses are fluid, which means that children essentially have to be reclassified over time. Like if there's 8 subclassifications and the diagnoses can be fluid, and we're literally going through subclassifications until we get to eventually being able to be analyzed for hEDS, that is so much medical oversight and diagnostics. And like, who is going to go through that? And who is going to diagnose 8 subcategories that don't have data to back them up? And it's supposed to be this fluid thing for children, as if children in the United States or anywhere have access to healthcare. Like, it's yeah, it's a tough one. And they say, that they have a new acronym for pediatric generalized HSD, which is of course different from pediatric generalized like hypermobility, whatever, PGHSD, and it's just like, why do we need a name that is 5 letters for the acronym PGHSD? Who's going to be like, I have PG?
I mean, nobody's even diagnosing people with HSD.
Right.
Still.
There's no medical code. Like, the medical code that I've seen people on the consortium use for this diagnosis for HSD is the medical code for, oh my gosh, what is it called? Deranged joint. There's literally a medical code called deranged joint. And that is what people with HSD is put in their charts when they're diagnosed by people who are in the consortium. So
I'm not sure that's and people who are not in the consortium, they're using the same old benign hypermobility codes as before. It might say hypermobility syndrome in the chart. It might say benign joint hypermobility, or joint hypermobility syndrome, the old JHS. But yeah.
So they then say that like an accurate pediatric generalized HSD diagnosis, which is one of these subcategories, right? Or like the bucket of one of the subcategories, which is going to be the one, and we'll look at it in a second. They say it provides a foundation for appropriate current treatment, which goes back to what Elle said. There is no medical code for HSD. So how are we doing 8 subcategories and that providing access to treatment? Like, just how? And they say, but not a lifelong diagnosis, which may result in over-medicalization and potential harms. The fact that they are focusing on this idea that people who are diagnosed with symptomatic hypermobility, that's over-medicalized, and we're over-medicalizing people and harming them through the diagnosis just by diagnosing, like, what? People with HSD do not get medical care. There is no over-medicalization. The potential harms are in the under-medicalization, are in the under-providing care. And that's what we see constantly. They then say the framework supports identifying those with hypermobility as a physical trait, which is relatively common. Again, the data they're using to base that claim on that it's just a physical trait that's relatively common is really not robust enough to say that. Then they say those with musculoskeletal issues related to their hypermobility and those who may develop the rarer hypermobile EDS syndrome as they mature. So they're coming now from a point of view that hEDS, you are not born with it. It develops over maturity. And the way we're going to find the gene that correlates to it,
or genes,
is by, not looking at any kind of child experience, which is already a very harmed situation. Like, children do not have access to care. They have fewer rights. It's bad for kids. It's really bad for kids. And now saying that, like, you can't have hEDS and be considered, having a severe impact on your quality of life until you're 18. How are you going to deal with accommodations? I mean, it just is really harmful. Al, what were you going to say?
It's incredibly violent. They will do the same thing they did for HSD, which is say they can all be severe. This isn't separating it by severity. That HSD should receive multi-symptom, multi-system care, that, HSD can be just as profound as hEDS. They'll say that same kind of thing to defend this. They'll say that, that group with just the musculoskeletal impacts, that can be so impactful. I think they're pretty much leaving in the dust the just a physical trait group. And if we look at demographics, who's that going to be? It's going to be the people who are poor. It's going to be trans folks. It's going to be people of color, whatever. But and they're actually rebranding this hypermobile EDS as rare, even though research has definitely shown it's not rare. But they will say that that research was just wrong or something because it was looking at this just hypermobility as a physical trait or just musculoskeletal issues. The separations are really, really strange. We have never once encountered a hypermobile person who did not have systemic impacts. This is not just musculoskeletal. It's just whether they're documented and whether they're diagnosed, right?
And there's so many factors that relate to whether they're documented or believed, right? Like your whole life, you're just trying to figure out how to be believed. I don't know how saying hEDS is now rare is going to help that. It's absolutely not.
It's not. And now we get to the point of why they're doing that. This framework will support targeted genetic testing. And they talk about yields and improving consistency of that testing. That's the whole point of this, in our opinion.
Yeah. And that's the only point of doing this reclassification. And in my opinion, you could do this kind of diagnostic subcategorization in your own goddamn study of children that you're getting genetic tests from. You could take a population of children who exhibit, you know, if we just want to talk about generalized joint hypermobility, and in your own study, on your own time, not published, you could separate these groups and their data by these things and see if they have any value to you. And yet, instead of doing that, they just decide we're going to do this reclassification, rebrand hEDS as rare, all in the name of finding the genetic issue. So it feels a little backwards to me. I'm gonna scroll.
Yeah. And it's about that agenda. Some people we've read this paper with, they've been like, this is so confusing, it doesn't make any sense. And yeah, it doesn't. It's twisting data, it's making conclusions that directly contradict things it's citing. But that confusion and the impact and goal of making this international recommendation rather than just doing their own separations within their own genetic research is to keep them at the top of the field, to keep them in control of the research in the field, to keep that insulation so that they, as in the EDS Society, can be making the determinations about what hypermobile disability is.
And, you know, it's not an accident that Tufts' 2009 paper had a really different, much more inclusive, overarching understanding of generalized joint hypermobility. And now she's the first author on this paper. Yeah. So, you know, none of this stuff.
Yeah.
Sometimes people just tell you who they are. That's mostly what happens. Yeah. You don't even have to ask.
Yeah. They come into that fold and they start making the decisions that are in the interest of that working group, which brings us to method. And this is truly wild. If you actually look at these citations, this is truly something else.
Take it away. Take it away.
So their methods, as in the research methods for this peer-reviewed published research, their methods cite a grand total of 5 things. They're saying the pediatric working group, which is part of the International Consortium on EDS and HSD that did the 2017, they met online throughout 2020 to 2022. Um, and the group is made up of all these people who have published work, done different things in different places. Um, and apparently, collectively, the group has seen some pediatric patients, and that has dictated a lot of what they're doing here. Now they say, so the first citation was actually them just meeting. Citation 8 is the working group and the international consortium. That's it. It's not research, it's just them citing themselves. And then they call this using a co-design methodology, which is citation 9. And that is literally them meeting. That's the co-design methodology. It's them meeting to talk about their things and make decisions together. So that's an actual citation in this paper. And highlighted in yellow here, we have them saying initially, evidence from the literature was reviewed, although limited because of varying definitions of GJH and diagnostic criteria, precluding clinically meaningful systematic reviews. And they cite the only actual citation in the methods, which is this big review that looks at hypermobility stats from different countries. It's the one where they say that it's less common in Europeans because of their healthy lifestyle, perhaps. So that's the only actual research that they used in methods, but they're citing it as like maybe the best systematic review that's there, while saying that there really isn't that much data out there.
And the thing is, there's, you know, not a lot of data that matches over the years, primarily because they keep renaming everything. Okay. So like they're digging their own hole here. Like this is not some situation they fell into. Like the fact that they reclassify and rename everything, well, then how are you supposed to compare things over time? You can't. So they're actually invalidating their own work. And this citation that they're citing is basically just saying, like, you know, overall, you know, the commonness ranges from this to this, and you can't really compare the studies because there's so much heterogeneity across literally every variable. So not just diagnostic categories, but, you know, sample sizes and time and, you know, gender and all of this stuff. So it's, anyway. And instead of summarizing it and being like, what is clinically meaningful is it's definitely way more common in people of color. It's definitely way more common in people assigned female at birth. And instead, they're just saying that there are no clinically meaningful systematic reviews. And so therefore, we are going to sit in closed door meetings. And because we've all seen about 5,000 pediatric patients altogether, that is enough for us. You know, that's enough data. That's enough peer-reviewed data for us to decide that that literature is null and our decisions are correct.
Right. And that's this confusion being intentional, and them renaming this over and over again being intentional. It allows them to keep control of the research that's happening and pursue their own agendas. So, you know, then we've got some more citations. And this is truly, it's truly something else. It's truly something else. There, so the so-called evidence, they're saying, was combined with experts' real-world experience to create the framework. They presented it at various conferences together. They made some revisions, and they continued to meet with each other. And then
Let's scroll down.
okay, citations 11 and 12. They are saying that stakeholder consultation was sought. They're making it sound like they consulted other experts. They consulted other people in the medical field, when who they actually consulted was other people within the Ehlers-Danlos Society. So 11 and 12, the stakeholder consultation is just them talking to each other again and making a so-called citation out of it. So that's a really, I mean, it shows you what their methods were. It's confusing if someone were reading this and like didn't know some historical context of how the 2017 reclassification came about, how insular the Ehlers-Danlos Society research field is, they might think, oh, this sounds great. They might not look at these citations. But if you actually look at what they're saying, their methods are pretty clear. It is just them and their opinions making decisions about an entire population. Right.
Yeah. And if, you know, one of the people on this paper isn't in the AHEAD coalition, definitely someone they publish with and work with frequently is. So it's also not like, I don't know, whoever peer reviewed this, like didn't actually look into any of their conflicts of interest because yeah, it's like, they're like, this is a review. Okay, no, it's not. We're using 3 papers that we're citing. All right. And then they're like, you know, these are observations that us experts are making. And that's our methods is we talk. Yeah.
So
And
then
we're
we
not,
get in.
oh, sorry. I was going to say, we're not talking to anyone else who has different ideas, who works with the community that we exclude, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And there are, we will talk about them when the moments come up, some very specific people who were clearly intentionally left out of this so-called review, people whose data actually shows something that would challenge this. And I mean, it is true they consulted stakeholders in their agenda, but they're making it sound like they consulted in a professional way with other people in the medical fields where they are actually interested in other opinions and not just working within one charity, which is not the case.
Right. Like, I'm sure that if they consulted the public and were like, should we subcategorize HSD into 8 subcategories for children? Everyone would have been like, fuck no. So...
Right. And that's who the stakeholders should be, but the power is currently not with people. Yeah. So then we get into discussion observations. This is a whole bunch of the rest of the paper. I'm going to consult my notes, Audrey, and let's see. Oh, you want to start? Go for it.
Basically, we're going to go through the table of their subcategories. And again, these subcategories of diagnoses are intended to be quote unquote fluid. What a fucking way to use that word. And so kids can be diagnosed with one and then next month be diagnosed with a different because all of a sudden they passed out at school or whatever it is, instead of just being like, maybe this is the same thing. And a reminder, there's 4 main categories. And then with the 4 main subcategories, they either do or don't have skin involvement. So this skin involvement focus is still really big for them. So, and basically, and I can't remember exactly where this is. I'm going to scroll. Oh, we'll get to that later. Okay. So this is the table 1. I'm going to try and zoom in a little bit more just because it's so tiny. And they're obviously trying to categorize for severity because it goes at the top from asymptomatic, then down to symptomatic, and likely are trying to subcategorize symptomatic conditions by level of severity. But this is them like deciding the table instead of like looking at any data whatsoever. So in the asymptomatic category, because of course there's still asymptomatic HSD or whatever, instead of benign. We don't want to use benign, but we'll say asymptomatic. There's pediatric generalized joint hypermobility, which basically just means that they're physically hypermobile, but there's no skin and tissue abnormalities, there's no musculoskeletal complications, and there's no comorbidities. I'd like to see data on that existing, where you actually asked the people what their life was and not just relied on medical care to have somehow magically diagnosed everyone correctly. Then also within the asymptomatic category, there's pediatric generalized joint hypermobility with skin involvement. So they are willing to say you can be asymptomatic as a child, have stretchy, soft skin that easily tears, has weird scars, but you're still asymptomatic. Slightly confusing to me. So in that situation, they've got the joint hypermobility and the tissue abnormalities in the skin. Like Elle said earlier, please, introduce us to somebody who has generalized joint hypermobility and doesn't have musculoskeletal complications. We wait.
And doesn't have systemic complications like gastrointestinal issues.
Or like mast cell or like cardio or neurological stuff. I mean,
yes, some manifestation of, things beyond just the joint.
Which like could be eczema,
Mm-hmm.
So like when we talk about these pediatric populations that these supposed studies are even sampling, they're not even asking, do you have eczema? Like that should exclude somebody from being considered just having generalized joint hypermobility. Anyway, I digress. So then we go into symptomatic conditions. So we've got first, we just went through the 2 asymptomatic subtypes, which is you just have joint hypermobility and you have hypermobility and your skin's kind of funny. Then we get into symptomatic. The first one, which they're thinking is the least bad one physically and in terms of quality of life, and that's just my assumption based on how they're organizing this, but I'm pretty sure we're right, is pediatric generalized joint hypermobility with core comorbidities. So they're basically saying if you have hypermobility that's visible on a Baton score and you have core comorbidities, you're potentially the least impacted symptomatic person. They're not outright saying that in the way they're organizing that. They kind of are.
And we'll go through later what core comorbidities they are considering.
Yes, and which ones they absolutely leave out.
Yeah.
Next on the scale of quote unquote severity is pediatric generalized joint hypermobility with core comorbidities and with skin involvement. So they think for some reason, if there's skin involvement, you have a worse quality of life. I think that's quite interesting because when we compare hEDS to another form of EDS, like classical EDS with really significant skin involvement, a lot of times those folks, or there's some data that shows that classical EDS is not as painful as hypermobile EDS and does not impact quality of life the same way. But here we are. The physical aesthetics rule all, right? Next up on the ladder of severity, so let's start at the beginning from symptomatic, we had generalized joint hypermobility with comorbidities. That's 1. 2, generalized joint hypermobility with comorbidities and skin involvement. That's the next. The third on the severity ladder is pediatric hypermobility spectrum disorder, musculoskeletal subtype. So not until partway through the symptomatic conditions of the subset of HSD, do we consider this actually HSD? And that means that they have the hypermobility, they don't have the skin and tissue abnormalities, but they do have musculoskeletal complications and they do have core comorbidities. That's assuming that the 2 diagnoses before then, the one with the just hypermobility and comorbidities and the just hypermobility and comorbidities and skin involvement, they're assuming that those people don't have musculoskeletal complications, that there are groups out there who don't have. Ooh. Yeah, it's a question. So then next up on severity, we have pediatric hypermobility spectrum disorder, or PHSD, musculoskeletal subtype with skin involvement. So now all of these people have musculoskeletal problems and hypermobility and skin involvement. Then they have pediatric hypermobility spectrum disorder systemic subtype, which basically just means that they don't have skin and tissue abnormalities. And the difference between that and the one before, which is musculoskeletal subtype with skin involvement, those first 2 musculoskeletal subtypes of HSD, don't have any comorbidities present. So they're like separating the symptomatic conditions with who has comorbidities and who doesn't. And the ones that do have, oh shit, except for their first one.
It is a mind fuck.
Oh my
Like,
God, this is so hard.
like anybody is going to be able to use this, and that's the thing. Nobody's going to use it, just like they didn't use HSD. But it's so there are things that are present and things they're not calling hypermobility spectrum disorders yet. And then there are also versions of the hypermobility spectrum disorder where things are not present. But clearly they are moving towards this final one, and this is what they're looking for. And earlier, I think we didn't mention, they also want there to be a family member who has hEDS. This is classic genetic research priorities. This last one, pediatric hypermobility spectrum disorder, systemic subtype with skin involvement, all of these things are present. And we think that's what they're actually looking to narrow people down to, and what they think might grow up into being that so-called rare hypermobile EDS. Anything more you want to say about? I mean, it's incomprehensible. It's not usable. It's certainly not practical like they're saying it is. It's going to do nothing for clinical care. It's just going to confuse people.
I mean, and how do you not get some of these confused? I mean, they're basically trying to say that symptomatic means you have I don't even understand what separates asymptomatic to symptomatic. I'm trying to figure it out right now and I can't. And I thought it was, I keep thinking of patterns and it ends up not being that.
They have versions for all of these where certain things are absent and present, and it's either symptomatic or it isn't. It makes no sense. You know, when you're first looking through, you're like, oh, is it the core comorbidities that make something symptomatic? But then you've got versions that are just that musculoskeletal type, even one with skin involvement, where the comorbidities are absent. And again, this is based in no data. And if it's based in any data, how are they collecting the data and thinking that it accurately represents people's experience with pain? Did you figure it out?
Maybe, but I'll probably put myself wrong. So in the asymptomatic section, there are no musculoskeletal complications or core comorbidities. And I think in all of the symptomatic conditions, there is at least one of each of those.
Yeah.
So basically what's interesting about that is they're trying to say that generalized joint hypermobility and skin and tissue abnormalities can be, you know, a non-symptomatic phenotype. But then they're like prioritizing skin and tissue in relation to the genetic narrowing. So what's interesting about it is they're kind of acknowledging that like the musculoskeletal complications and the comorbidities are the most disabling, but then, you know, above, they basically are like, we don't deal with comorbidities. Okay.
Anyway, so those are the new recommendations for how to diagnose and treat hypermobile children. As Audrey, if you scroll down a little.
I'll scroll down.
We're going to move on to their claim, their nonsensical claim that this framework does not exclude other types of EDS and other connective tissue disorder diagnoses, while they're actively recommending that hypermobile children not be assessed for hypermobile EDS or even genetically tested. So this makes no sense.
Yeah,
they're expecting, yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Al.
They're expecting people to go through that fluid repeat diagnostic process, which I think, Audrey, you counted it to be 13 specialists prior to a diagnosis that would be useful in any way. They're saying don't do genetic testing, but then it's required prior to using a checklist. Doesn't make any sense.
Right. So it's like they're contradicting themselves from page 3 to, I think, page 4. They're saying, you know, individuals need to be assessed for alternate diagnosis, including next generation sequencing panel-based testing. So they're saying including all of these very specific kinds of genetic testing, and they list those, I think, on the next page. They say they have to have this kind of genetic testing before they can be diagnosed with the fluid thing. But then they're saying if they have the fluid thing, we don't recommend genetic testing on all of them.
Right. And I think the way they will respond to this when they're questioned, the way they'll get around this is similar to how people responded in 2017 to what does this mean for people who are not, you know, going to be assessed by geneticists and therefore not going to get genetic testing. They're going to say it should be left up to someone's clinical reasoning. They actually use clinical reasoning as language in here. So they're absolving themselves of the responsibility, making a recommendation not to assess people. They're saying the minimum age hypermobility should be assessed is 5 years old. And like,
they're saying the only way that someone younger could be assessed is if they have at least two recurrent severe hernias as like an infant, or even in the NICU. Like they won't even let a child in the NICU who's had a severe hernia be assessed for this. They have to have 2. That's absurd.
mm-hmm.
Like that absolutely kills people.
Yeah, and just like the separation of hEDS and HSD killed hypermobile people then, hypermobile adults, this is going to kill children through practitioners being confused and children not being assessed, because practitioners are going to be educated that they should not assess children for this because there's no way of telling if it's symptomatic or not. And of course, their line will be like, well, they should use that clinical reasoning. And, you know, if they suspect vascular EDS, still test. Is that going to happen? Is that going to happen to Black children in the US? Absolutely not. So we're really setting something up to be incredibly deadly. And
to name the things they want the excluded first, they want families to exclude other forms of EDS, even though they don't recommend all children be tested for EDS. Other heritable disorders of connective tissue like Marfan's, osteogenesis imperfecta, et cetera, syndromic conditions, which could be a whole pot of things, chromosomal microdeletions, skeletal dysplasia, or neuromuscular disorders. So when I counted, it was at least 13. I think it ended up being closer to 15 as the minimum. But a family would have to have their child see 15 diagnosing specialists just to get that first diagnosis within this fluid framework of 8 subtypes. 15. Right. You don't, I mean, how? There's not enough time in someone's life.
No. Well, it's yet another example of this isn't actually intended to be clinically used widely. All those, you know, exclusions they're talking about here are the things that they would use in their personal research to make sure that they are narrowing in on what they think will be the genetic factor for hypermobile EDS / this most severe type of HSD that maybe grows into it, which doesn't make any sense, of course. We know we're born with what we have and then are affected by various things. But
anyway, talk about Sabiha Malek's work and data pointing to it not being genetic in the way that they want it to be genetic. It's much more complex than that. It does have to do with genetic things, but it has to do with much more complex genetic things.
Right. And Malek's work is, of course, very important work of the last few years that has, of course, been left out of this research, of this review, of this literature review.
Narrative review that is actually changing everybody's life in one fell swoop, but we're not going to tell anyone that the paper's coming out. I wonder why.
Yeah. And I'm sure they know about that research, but they're choosing not to include it because it's proposing mechanisms that are complex and can be applied to this reality of common hypermobile issues affecting the whole body. this section is also where we get into how they are defining biological maturity more. They define it as skeletal maturity with growth velocity of less than 1 centimeter a year, using 2 measures at least 3 months apart, or a mature bone X-ray. So like, what? Who's
I
gonna
think
do this?
right. And I think this is where the 15 actually, it was 13 just to get seen, but then to figure out if you're of biologic maturity, that would take 2 other visits, like diagnostic appointments, because they're
Yeah,
saying at least 3 months apart.
yeah.
Um,
Completely impractical, and exposing people to needless radiation also. And fun fact, the X-ray citation, the citation they use there, 13, I believe,
yeah.
is a paper from the 50s, um, about just X-rays of the wrist done at Stanford. Like, it has nothing to do with hypermobility. Um, yeah. And they're saying that adolescents who reach this very subjective maturity before 18 should be assessed with the 2017 hEDS criteria. But who's going to be making those decisions? Them
Well,
in their insular research, maybe, but not actually clinicians.
well, and also like, there's often bone involvement in EDS and HSD. And so the idea that the age of biologic maturity in a quote unquote healthy normal population, it should not be applied to the biologic maturity. I mean, I don't think we need to define biologic maturity right now, but like if we were to, because of the complications and kind of the bone involvement with connective tissue syndromes generally, like even if this citation were real and somehow made a little bit of sense, you still can't apply it to the population because of the bone involvement. So Godspeed.
Here we are. And then next they go on to say that a currently established cutoff for the Baton score for children is greater than or equal to 6 out of 9. And then this is what they do in this paper. They acknowledge that there's research that shows that there are very significant gender differences when it comes to, this is the 14-year-old study, citation 3. But then saying that it's not enough to actually say anything. So they're just going to keep that 6 out of 9 cutoff. They're not going to lower it. They're not going to vary it by gender, whatever.
These papers, at least one of them is showing that the 6 out of 9 cutoff should only specifically be for young girls, like under age like 8 or something like that. And then they're generalizing it to 14-year-olds. I mean, these papers are not just about 14-year-olds. So the fact that they're also using those numbers is kind of weird to me, that they're like cherry picking a subcategory and then the data they're referencing isn't even what's recommended for that subcategory necessarily.
They are. And they're using their constructed idea of biologic maturity to dismiss that data. They're saying neither study provided enough information about biological maturity to assess the relevance of their findings.
Even though one of them did something really fucking creepy, sorry, and to assess biologic maturity. So stop with this. You know what I mean? It's just gross. This focus on, it's truly just gross. And it's this arbitrary idea of even what like puberty is, like biologic maturity of what organ system? You know what I mean? Like we can't just be like, this is it. Is it biologic maturity of the bones? Is it biologic maturity of the brain? How do you even think about that? What if somebody, didn't get care because they were diagnosed with some weird version of HSD or nothing when they were young and had developmental stuff and didn't get the kinds of accommodations that they needed in school? And, it just
yeah, including like in treatment for gastrointestinal issues that led to malnourishment, and then they're underdeveloped for their age as medicine generally measures things. It's all around horrible. They're going on to say that the Baton score has been found to be substantial to excellent. And of course,
But
yeah,
what's funny is they're only saying the inter-rater and intra-rater reliability, which just means that different people can do it and they're still quite, they rate the same scores. Like they're being clever here because they know that there's a lot of data that has shown the Baton is not a good measure of hypermobility and of severity and on and on and on. So they're saying, oh, what has been found to be substantial to excellent is the reality that lots of people can do it and usually get the same scores. So that's
it's easy. Let's just keep using it, even if it isn't accurate. Yeah. And of course, ignoring Sabiha-Malek's work again, which is the Baton not being effective that we're talking about. Not that Sabiha is the only person who has talked about that. People have been talking about that for decades. And they want to add this upper limb hypermobility assessment tool, that's citation 15, which is yet to be validated in children. Oh, but it gives them this exciting opportunity, right? That's sarcasm. And they want to use the lower limb assessment score, which is citation 16, so that they can plan clinical interventions and future research on phenotyping. This is, again, them trying to separate things and use tools that they think will find the things they're looking for so that they can do the research they want to do.
It's just, I don't know. There's such a simpler way to be going about all of this. And I'm really,
well, but they don't want to provide care. They might think or say they want to provide care, but that isn't the goal of any of this.
No, I mean, that's true. I'm going to scroll down.
Yeah. I think that brings us to figure 1, right, which is the actual checklist. This is the pediatric counterpart of the 2017 hEDS checklist. And we have, of course, got the Baton, and they're saying it has to be a minimum of 6 out of 9.
Which again is not a unified cutoff number. It's not suggested for all, even like under 18 populations, especially of different genders. If we were to call gender that binary. And we have clients whose kids do not meet the 5 out of 9 or just barely meet the 5 out of 9 and have some of the most impactful experiences and then don't get the diagnosis because of the Baton. And now that it's being bumped up to a 6, it's really, it's especially going to be harmful for certain people who have very, certain hypermobility and spasticity patterns. It's going to be really discriminatory based on that.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the next thing they focus on is skin and tissue abnormalities. And they say themselves that this is designed to complement the 2017 criteria. And we'll talk after we go through this actual checklist about how messed up it is that they included, especially these top 2 points. So in skin and tissue, you have to get a score of 3 out of 6 minimum. They've got soft skin, stretchy skin, stretch marks, different kinds of scarring. Again, these pysogenic papules in the heel that have no correlation at all to quality of life or symptom sets, and recurrent hernia or hernia in more than one site. But they're excluding certain types of common congenital hernias. So people have to check off things there. And then if you scroll down a little bit more, Audrey, we've got the musculoskeletal complications, which is, let's see, episodic activity related pain not meeting the chronic pain frequency and duration criteria. Okay. So pain that, what does this mean? I actually didn't read through that one before. Episodic activity related pain, like pain from activity.
Yeah, like they're basically saying you are a kid and you went to the playground and now your knee hurts.
Yeah. Then we've got dislocations and subluxations and the absence of trauma. Then we've got soft tissue injuries, one major needing surgical repair and or current multiple minor tendon and or ligament tears. And someone
Which
has
is
got to
it's wild that kids have to have these kinds of soft tissue injuries to be considered having musculoskeletal complications, because most adults like don't have that shit. And also the fact, now I'm realizing, the episodic activity related pain not meeting the chronic pain frequency or and duration criteria, they don't want to include chronic pain in musculoskeletal complications. That is horrific.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, they don't include it, and yeah, they don't want to focus on things that actually affect people's lives, just those things that they can objectively measure, right? So someone has to have 2 out of 3 of those.
They're like, in order for you to be really hypermobile, you can't like have pain for more than 3 months as a child. Like, are you joking? Are you joking? I'm sorry. I'm just realizing this. This is upsetting.
It's really upsetting. They're making it so incredibly strict, and a prerequisite for people actually meeting this criteria would be them going through repeat traumas.
Yeah.
Not getting care and going through repeat traumas, repeat injuries to even be considered for things, rather than seeing hypermobility itself as a risk factor for those traumas and supporting the kid to begin with as a risk factor for all these systemic complications. Which brings us to what they're calling the comorbidities, if you want to scroll down again. And what they've included, the core comorbidities thing, is just what they've decided to include in their checklist. So that's what they're calling the core comorbidities. And they go on to justify why. Surprise, it was a group consensus, not data. They're including chronic primary pain. So they're putting pain as a comorbidity, chronic fatigue.
It's not, sorry. I'm sorry. So they're saying that chronic pain is a comorbidity. It's not actually a musculoskeletal complication. Are you joking me? The only pain receptors are exclusively housed in connective tissue. Anyway, it just continue.
Yeah. Well, again, it's something that the person reports about their own experience, rather than the provider can do some type of scan or some type of test and be like, oh, there's tissue damage here, or a dislocation that has to be relocated.
Even scans for connective tissue, I mean, it's very hard to image connective tissue. There's really a good way.
Barrier after barrier. We've got chronic fatigue, of course, which is funny that they're separating from dysautonomia, but they don't understand mechanism. We've got functional GI disorders. And when we look at how they explain this in the comorbidities section, we realize what they're cutting out by labeling it that way and who. Functional bladder disorders, similar thing. Primary dysautonomia and anxiety. And Audrey's boxed out anxiety in red because, of course, they're including it. They love to blame things on anxiety. And the funny thing for how they measure the comorbidities is they don't even put number. It's not a number out of a number. It's any number causing distress or disability. So they go on to explain this later, that they're including the comorbidities just in case they're distressing or contributing to disability of the child. And if they determine that is yes, and this is totally subjective, right? Based on the people believing the child's reports of things and the child feeling safe to, and the child's communication style, right?
And the parents being supportive.
Right.
Who've learned to cope with these things over generations, right?
Right.
And figure out,
Yeah. So they're including those comorbidities, but really not looking deep at them, which they think is a step up from the 2017 reclassification that just completely left out comorbidities and put the hypogenic papules in there instead of, pain or chronic fatigue or GI issues. So that's the end of the checklist. Yeah, Audrey.
My what the fuck does that mean box here is in relation to the causing distress or disability, yes or no, because I've never seen anyone use that term before in talking about disability in medical research. And just the fact that anxiety is included, like, and not other things that show similarly high or higher prevalences. Nepotism is a really good way to understand this. So these closed door meetings, these people who are consulting these stakeholders who are themselves, who started the anxiety thing? That's the, what is it called when it's not like a bingo question, but
$1 million question?
riddle of the day.
Riddle of the day. Oh yeah, we'll have to do another video on that one. But yeah, there's a reason they focus on anxiety. And because they've separated things out again, where you've got this asymptomatic stuff that can have comorbidities, you're setting hypermobile people up to just be labeled as having anxiety and probably later in their life having mood disorders and other things like that, rather than addressing their physical systemic issues. And of course, rather than acknowledging the undeniable intersection of hypermobility and neurodivergence, which is something that they did not want to do. And just give a little kind of honorable mention in their non-core comorbidities section without citing any of the actual relevant research. So we've got some prerequisites in the checklist too, which make things make even less sense. Audrey scrolled down again, and it's saying that this framework can only be used after exclusion of other Ehlers-Danlos subtypes, heritable disorders of connective tissue, syndromic conditions, blah, from biologic maturity or the 18th birthday, whichever is earlier, use the 2017 hEDS criteria. So this is, again, them saying you need to rule all those things out. You need to see 1 million doctors for this even to be considered, and saying, you know, we shouldn't even look at children for this. But I guess they'll leave it all up to clinical discretion.
Page 3 literally says, we don't recommend genetically testing all pediatric kids with generalized joint hypermobility. And then they say the only way they can be assessed for even these asymptomatic diagnoses is by having that genetic assessment. So,
yeah.
Plug that hole too, real quick. And then they say, no genetic cause for hEDS has been identified at the time of publication of the checklist, because shit's a brewing. In the future, disease-causing genetic mutations may be identified in hEDS. Could that be anything they are hinting to? I don't know. In that scenario, if that were to happen, we're not saying it's going to. In that scenario, if a child has a biological parent with an hEDS diagnosis and a confirmed disease-causing genetic mutation, so your parent with an hEDS diagnosis also has to have a mutation, we know that shit's not consistent, you know? And the child also has the same mutation, then the hEDS diagnosis should be used. So the only way a child can get an hEDS diagnosis without being of biologic maturity is if their parent has a genetic mutation and hEDS and may have the exact same genetic mutation.
Yeah, or they find something that they're going to call genetic mutations for hEDS, which are only going to apply to a tiny portion of the population that is experiencing these symptoms. And then setting up numerous barriers for that child to even be diagnosed with hEDS anyway. But it's all going to be dependent on those factors. And we really think that they're narrowing things down in this way to find a factor for that thing and then screw everyone else. And everyone else is, you know, I don't know about a percentage, Audrey, 95% of connective tissue disorders, probably not going to have any, you know, isolatable genetic factor.
Because it's way more complicated than that. And the 2009 Tufts paper that is cited in this like, you know, the argument that these kinds of diagnoses should not be limited to only people with EDS even, and those genetic mutations, like, I think that's completely right. Like, this is something that's way bigger than what they're trying to make it be. And they're just denying in these ways that make it so confusing. Like Ella's saying, like, who's going to be the clinical quarterback, as doctors like to say? You know, who's going to be like, oh, I'm a geneticist, I want to deal with this now? Absolutely not. Geneticists are going to stop diagnosing. Like,
which happens with the HSD in 2017. People
exactly.
stop seeing even hEDS because, you know, they haven't found a factor. They've separated these things out yet again, even after decades of people finding out they're exactly the same thing, need the same kinds of treatment. So that's always been the goal. This obsession with genetic determinism, all just eugenics, as we're always saying. But this paper in particular is really upsetting because of who it's going to affect, and how severe these barriers they're putting on children are, and what children with hypermobility already go through. Like, it was bad enough. It was bad enough.
And like, you know, especially young children. I think, I mean, there's so much about this that makes my gut churn, and, you know, young children's rights. And I just, it's really, for them to have such severe, kind of horrific, traumatic hospital experiences in order to be even considered for early intervention, or for intervention at all that's accurate, is horrible. I can't imagine being a parent and having to go through that. I don't think these people on this consortium imagined that either, or if they did, they must have a pretty, I don't even know what to call it, just really dissociated from the reality of how these things work. It's disgusting.
Yes,
so
it is.
Go to the next page.
Scroll down and we'll actually break down these things now, I guess. Oh right. Them not using data again. So that good old group consensus. What an objective way to conduct research. It is the eugenic way, though. They really like to get together in their room and say that their opinion is an objective fact. So
it's all about boys clubs who have like matching pins or something. You know what I mean? Like, that's, I don't know, maybe like the zebra could be that.
Yeah, it used to be like rings and pins, and now it's probably zebra merch. You know, and money, I'm sure, is greatly involved here. So anyway, the group consensus was to retain the 5 skin items in alignment with the 2017 hEDS adult criteria, despite soft skin and stretchy skin, they're admitting, being largely objective and no data being available on pypsogenic papules in children. I mean, pypsogenic papules should never have been there to begin with. But so this is actually interesting. I'm trying to figure out, oh, that 17, citation 17. They're saying here they chose to include these things. And then if you actually look at what they're citing, citation 17 looked at, it was a study looking at 100 children, looking at these different factors that have been associated with hypermobile conditions, and grouping the children on a spectrum of severity based on functional impairment assessment. So, you know, how much these things impacted their quality of life, or how much their quality of life was impacted, and then trying to associate those with various factors. And Audrey, you might need to explain p-value, but I'm going to read out what p-values were. The p-value for soft skin was 0.387. Oh, why don't you explain it before I say what it is?
So a p-value is like kind of one of the main statistics that in the science community at large, they accept as a measure of significance of the data. Like, If something is significantly different, it means there was statistical evidence showing that these things are correlated, or, you know, there's some kind of relationship between the two variables. Correlation is not causation, but, you know, we know that. So a p-value of less than 0.05 is considered statistically significant. A lot of p-values that are actually significant and that will, you know, if we repeated the study, likely we would get that same outcome, are going to be less than, you know, 0.001. Anything that is slightly less than 0.05, like a 0.03 or a 0.04 or even a 0.01, some people think there's been kind of an over-reliance on p-values and their, you know, representation of statistical significance. And so it's a much better way to actually, as they get closer to 0.05, think of it more as a trend rather than actually being significant. And that, you know, there is a high possibility that if you repeated that study, you would get the opposite outcome or a different outcome. So we want something to be like less than 0.01 to even really consider it somewhat significant and reproducible.
And the p-value in this study they're citing for soft skin is 0.387,
Which
so not significant at all. Stretchy skin is 0.97, not significant. Scarring, however, is 0.02, so maybe a little significant.
Maybe.
Stretch marks is 0.039, so maybe a little significant.
No, but
anyway,
like,
all this is saying soft skin and stretchy skin definitely aren't significant. In this study, you know, people, regardless of their functional impairment, they kind of shared these traits pretty evenly. And yet, in this proposed criteria, they are choosing to keep those just to match the 2017 criteria.
And they are stating that the presence of scarring and stretch marks predicts greater disability, whereas soft skin and stretchy skin did not. But like, I don't think you can make that statement with this data, even though those 2 points are slightly significant. Like, that's not a statement you can make here out of what, 100 kids?
Right. And using
multi-system disability, no.
Yeah. Continuing to use these skin features, which were the origin of Ehlers-Danlos medical classification, when today we have so much other data when it comes to symptom sets, is truly atrocious. But they like what they can measure themselves instead of listening to the patient.
And what's different from other diagnoses that are all turning out to maybe be the same thing, because they're also associated. So it's them trying to kind of also define their own area of expertise and kind of keep their power in what they think is different than other diagnoses and kind of things that are the exact same symptom sets.
Right. Yeah. And that would enable them, it continues to enable them to not take the responsibility of caring for the majority of this population and be able to pretend that this thing is rare and narrow populations and search for a genetic determination for, you know, maybe a few people who would currently be categorized as hypermobile EDS. So they can say they finally found the last gene, or genes. It will definitely not be one gene. Then they go on to talk about these umbilical hernias. They're basically saying that certain things are common. They're saying congenital umbilical hernia is a common phenomenon in the pediatric population, and inguinal and umbilical hernia are common post-neonatal intensive care. So hernias of this nature should not be counted. They're saying that because these things are so common in pediatric and neonatal babies, they shouldn't be counted towards any of this diagnostic category, as though that isn't actually evidence that this is an incredibly common connective tissue issue that is affecting those populations.
Right. And like, the data of prevalence shows essentially as common as these hernias are, right? And like, why, and I know why, I know the answer, but I just keep going back to the question of like, why are they separating data? Why are they saying these two things are different? You know, and what is the point? The fact that an umbilical hernia is not considered severe enough to be considered for this fluid pediatric classification that includes asymptomatic forms of generalized joint hypermobility, but then they had an umbilical hernia at birth. That's not asymptomatic, number one. But number, like, it just, wow. It's really, you know, hEDS and HSD, they're common. They're common. The data shows that they're common. These umbilical hernias are common. I just, wow.
Yeah. And this is the whole forcing those kids to go through trauma and maybe even die. They're saying that what will be counted is kids who have had recurrent hernias. So terrible, really, really bad. It's really, really bad.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't know of many people who have had recurrent umbilical hernias in this population pool.
It's inguinal that they're citing. Yeah. 3 to 10-year-olds with inguinal hernias. It's the thing they're citing to justify why, you know, recurrent hernias is something that they're going to include. Because the, you know, the one-time birth trauma ones are too common.
Funny. They're like, that's so funny that they're like, this kind of hernia is really common, so we're not going to count it, even though we're not saying that all of these subcategories are rare. We're only saying hEDS is rare. Okay. And then they're saying like, they're using the case control of only inguinal hernia after they say there have to be multiple hernias. Then they're citing the study with only one hernia, finding statistically significant higher proportion of patients with generalized joint hypermobility at a Baton score of greater than or equal to 6 out of 9 in children compared to age and sex matched controls. So they're saying these things actually don't relate at all. And then they're citing a paper that says they do.
I mean, this is why people are saying how bad this paper is. And like, yes, it's bad. It's bad science. It's bad research. It's badly written. But there is a function to it. So then we're getting into musculoskeletal episodic and activity-related pain. Their way of skirting around chronic pain being like one of the central symptoms of hypermobile disability. So they're, of course, saying because obviously an association between hypermobility and this type of pain from activity has been found. And they're separating out what they consider just adolescents and symptomatic children. And when you actually look at those papers, the adolescents, the 19 and 20 are showing elevated risk of pain and injury among hypermobile folks, hypermobile children. And then 21, which is symptomatic children, is when there's been an injury from activity that's objectively provable. You know, they've torn something. So it's, again, what they're considering symptomatic is stuff that they can measure rather than what they would consider more qualitative data of children reporting pain.
Which is terrible because, I mean, within the work that we do, what we know is that pain does not work one way. Dislocating and subluxing can turn numb at first, you know, like the kind of, there can be chronic low-grade swelling. Like there's just,
yeah.
To say it can only be observable if you have this huge tear. Well, when you're more bendy, sometimes you actually don't tear as easily because you have to bend really far before the tear actually happens. So
or you're micro tearing in places that they aren't measuring in their imaging.
Or the tear is too, you know, within normal limits. Or the tear is, you know, not significant, or however the radiologist report it.
Yeah. And this symptomatic study they cite even separates pain in children. Pain from injury is basically considered real, and pain when there wasn't an obvious injury is considered psychosomatic. Otherwise, it's all in the children's head. So that is the type of research that's really informing this. That's what Audrey was talking about with the nepotism and anxiety. It's, you know, this idea that what people are experiencing if they can't meet these completely arbitrary, ridiculous criteria is psychological. And, you know, if they've been through incredible amounts of trauma and managed to survive and have certain privileges, then okay, we might give them some sort of diagnosis. Woohoo. So that brings us to joint instability. And, you know, this is a pretty obvious one. Surprise. Hypermobility and joint instability are highly, highly correlated. Like, duh.
In all populations, across populations, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. Yet they're making recommendations not to diagnose children with anything useful, even though they know that joint dislocations and hypermobility are correlated in children as well as adults. So that's this whole thing. We get into soft tissue injuries, similar stuff. They know that it's happening. They're probably saying things here about how the evidence wasn't good enough. This is when they bring in imaging, right? They're like, oh, the group consensus again was that for clarity and consistency, the need for surgery or imaging findings of tissue damage was the minimum required to provide certainty of soft tissue injury and definitive diagnosis of a local cause.
So, and F off, because some of the most prolific connective tissue researchers in the connective tissue research field, which is absolutely separate from the connective tissue syndrome research field, just to be crystal clear, like they do not intersect. Like we might be in a connecting link, but that might be in a few years too. So there's this person named Helen Langvin who's been doing connective tissue research at a cellular kind of level for a long time. And she's just starting to get into talking about hypermobility and how the connective tissues are different in hypermobile people or hypermobile areas versus areas where there's, you know, less movement, which, you know, these things always come together. And, you know, she's been doing imaging of soft tissue and connective tissue for years, looking at how acupuncture needles shift the structure, et cetera, et cetera. And she and other people in this research field are like, there are no good ways to image connective tissue. Like, even if you get a really fancy ultrasound, it's not going to be good enough for what you're trying to look for and see. And so this idea that medical imaging and radiologic imaging is going to determine whether or not someone was injured, yeah, it just doesn't, like, it feels like we're going back 30 years in a lot of
I mean, it's gonna miss the majority of all injuries, just like this criteria is missing the majority of all hypermobile children.
Well, they're not thinking about whole body patterns or spinal instability or ways that, you know, you can have a chronically subluxed shoulder. You know what I mean? Like, these aren't like simple phenomena that only show up in one way and the body only responds in one way. So I think that's the other really frustrating stuff.
Frustrating to talk about this stuff. Is that what you said?
Yeah. Did I cut out?
Yeah, you cut out for just a second.
So
yeah, then we move on to the core comorbid conditions. They are saying that they included these because they've been reported in studies at frequency of more than 10%. We were not able to access that paper. It's on quality of life in hypermobile children. But they're saying, okay, they picked these ones because of that. Later, they say they didn't pick other comorbidities because they didn't meet that 10% cutoff, but that's statistically inaccurate with available research. There are things that show way more than 10%. Anyway, they picked these. It was another group consensus, probably. And they're ones that we went through. But I think this thing, oh yeah, Audrey.
I want to read this one sentence on this page.
The underlined thing, the gaslighting. Yeah, go for it.
So they say, the group considered comorbidities to add complexity to an individual's presentation. So although they do not influence the diagnosis overall, excuse me, what? A different subtype in the framework is assigned if they are present and distressing or disabling to the child. They're like, what? So you're trying to kind of acknowledge that, oh yeah, these might be the most disabling situations, you know, it's on the higher end of the spectrum of severity. You know, we're going to acknowledge, you know, that they exist and they can be, what do they say? In the thing, distress, disabling or something weird like that. Stress or disability. Which anyway, then they're saying that, oh yeah, that adds complexity to the person's presentation, mentioning absolutely nothing about care, but it doesn't actually influence the diagnosis overall. So it doesn't really matter the amount of comorbidities and complexity of the actual case that they are.
Which is why they have that yes, no, distress or disability in the checklist instead of numbers. However, like,
who is going to get a POTS diagnosis and be like, yeah, I got it, but it's not distressing at all? No, like, it doesn't work.
This to me is gaslighting 101. It's their response to the community being like, why aren't the comorbidities in the checklist? And they're like, well, put it in there to validate the children, but it doesn't actually mean anything because we don't care.
And you can herniate 4 times, but I don't think you're that hypermobile.
Right. So that's fun. If you scroll down, I'll talk through some of the comorbidities. Oh, we've got table 2. So it's just gonna confuse us and mess us up to try to make sense of this table. The gist of this table is it shows that all these things are incredibly present and inextricably linked. It shows that, like, that's it. It's showing that, you know, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, functional gastrointestinal disorders, bladder dysfunction, dysautonomia, anxiety, all show up in this population. Surprise, surprise. They are manifestations of connective tissue disability. And they, you know, cite different sources. They show different percentages that have been found. But like, that's the takeaway. But that's not necessarily their takeaway. They're showing that these things are inextricably linked, while still pretending that it's okay to focus on meaningless aesthetic features over these so-called comorbidities, which are really the most impactful manifestations of this condition. So
I also just want to name really quick that, like, they're saying that these citations are irrespective of joint hypermobility. Joint hypermobility wasn't assessed in these papers. So you can't say one thing or another. You can't say it's not linked or it is, because it wasn't assessed and analyzed. So,
yeah. Yep. So this allows them to keep that hEDS framework they used in 2017, use it the way they want to for their own research, and just keep denying the multi-system impact that the majority of hypermobile people, including children, experience. And like, this data is on children. Like, children are in pain, children are fatigued, they're experiencing all these issues, but let's not diagnose them with something that actually has name recognition.
Right? Or that explains why they're having all of these problems simultaneously. Exactly. Let's not make any connections between the multi-system issues, even though they interact so heavily with each other, to be able to understand how to treat and manage them. Let's just separate them and leave them in their own worlds. I mean, it's just the opposite. I mean, it's like opposite day reading this. It's like, what? Why did you do that? Like,
And it's always opposite day when you're looking at Ehlers-Danlos Society research and you actually are thinking about connective tissue and prevalence, you know, it's always this way. But this is extreme. You want to scroll down.
Yeah.
I want to mention, so they're saying the co-comorbidities identified have these established diagnostic definitions, as if those are widely known, right? The GI source they're using, the Rome Foundation, is a brain and gut nonprofit. So it's again that connection to anxiety and psychosomatic shit, you know. Um, so that's a particularly bad classification that they're using to make their determinations there with GI disorders. And highlighted in red, we've got the consensus was that the current diagnostic frameworks for each of these conditions should be used in an individual who also has hypermobility. It's just like,
Because
as if these things are known. Yeah.
They're just unwilling to acknowledge that there are variations in hypermobile populations of these things, and there are specific patterns. I mean, it's so dismissive of research, of people's lived experiences, of the ways they've been called out, you know, even just calling these things functional or syndromes. That has a long history in medical dismissal and gaslighting and denial and blame and shame. And when we actually think about, oh, well, every single muscle cell is surrounded by connective tissue, connected to other muscle cells by connective tissue, wrapped together, connected to nerves and vessels with connective tissue, you know, and on and on and on. And, you know, they just want to separate and say they're completely different things when, like, excuse me, like, how have you ever thought about it, you know?
Well, and this is their perfect way of saying that those things aren't their responsibility, rather than admitting that those are actually core manifestations of connective tissue syndromes. They're saying there's these separate things that those specialists should treat.
They are completely flying the signal, allowing for many people to psychiatrize children at extremely high rates, not provide them any care, and basically say that their problems are just in their head. They're too stressed at home. You know, they should exercise more and everything will be fine. Like the way that this paper is allowing that to happen is horrific, when they know that it's so unfortunate how they have no backbone. Like, that's
for the community, they have quite a bit of impressive arrogance and backbone when it comes to defending their own ridiculous non-data driven viewpoints, but no actual
well, they just don't have any, they won't take any accountability or responsibility for the harms that they have created and they are continuing to enable. I mean, this is one of the most enabling papers that's come out in a long time. Well, since the 2017 reclassification, I guess.
Well, there might be some Bulbana ones in the mix there that, you know.
It's true.
Anyway, but, so yeah,
we're upset, as you can tell.
Yeah. And you know, sorry, what?
Go. You're good. Sorry.
I don't know what you're gonna ask, but blah blah blah. I don't think that chronic pain is particularly it's just like, of course it's there. It's the same stuff we've been talking about. They're not assessing hypermobility well. They're using this high Baton cutoff, but it's still super significant. It's everywhere, of course it is. You can even see here that chronic musculoskeletal pain is considered secondary to Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I mean, that's in the WHO classification. And like, this is the whole field is based on this enormous fallacy, thinking that that's secondary rather than an inevitable impact of the mechanism and care and neglect.
Right. Like when you tear connective tissue and it's like base level membranes, right? Or like it's like a deep layer, or it's like, you know, localized in a really strange way that distributes weight in a weird way. Like, and then you have mast cell, and so you chronically don't heal very quickly, and your proprioception is kind of wonky, so you like accidentally redo it a lot. Like, and chronic pain is secondary.
Right.
I'm sorry, the receptors being directly activated by the impacted connective tissue are pain receptor. Like, again, the logic is a specific agenda, like Ella's been saying.
Yeah.
And also relates to them saying, you know, that people with chronic musculoskeletal pain have low pressure pain thresholds. That whole area of pain medicine can just be debunked. Like that is research that is, you know, as stinky as the BMI, to be honest.
Yeah.
The
Yeah, they
idea,
get into that right at the end there with some central nervous system involvement of
even though there's
musculoskeletal pain.
no evidence of that, none.
Right. Just calling it hypersensitivity instead of acknowledging that these tissues are being impacted. So that takes us into chronic fatigue. And there's just one quote from that section that I want to say. I'm not sure it's on this page or the next one, but they say about chronic fatigue that the mechanisms underlying chronic fatigue and generalized joint hypermobility are yet to be determined. And this is this is another one of those things where it's like they're yet to be acknowledged by the Ehlers-Danlos Society. The idea that they're yet to be determined, and that I don't know if you have anything to say about that, Audrey, but like not thinking about connective tissue, not thinking about dysautonomia, not thinking about mast cell, and just thinking that fatigue is this mysterious thing rather than there are obvious things going on in the structures of the body.
And like, you know, what if you looked at research slightly out of your area of expertise and like looked at what the mechanisms of chronic fatigue are thought to be now that long COVID has accelerated that research? It's connective tissue microclots, and then like blood, hyperoxygenating blood. There are tissues that weren't as oxygenated before and were kind of hypoxic, and then it gets damaged. Like there are real biologic mechanisms that are being talked about right now about these things. And to separate these categories and then cherry pick data and then like completely ignore the proposed mechanisms, like what, I'm sorry, what kind of review is this?
Right. Not a
Like,
review. Yeah. Them ignoring all that research allows them to keep these things as comorbidities instead of challenging the entire diagnostic framework for hEDS/HSD, allowing them to hoard their knowledge of connective tissue and their kind of power of diagnosing these things and saying how they should be diagnosed. And just control that narrative. Again, like Audrey said at the beginning, narrative review is just them telling their story.
It is. They're just telling their own story, and they don't do a very good job of it. Is the other part, like, you know, the contradictions of being like, these two things don't correlate, and then citing a paper that shows that they correlate. You know, like it, that kind of, it just, it's hard to
It's
make.
not well done.
I don't
but
buy.
it will have a really huge impact. And they've also presented this at various conferences. It isn't like this paper is the only version of this criteria. This paper may be the paper written up to propose it. But anyway, if we scroll to the next page to continue with functional gastrointestinal, the thing I want to point out here that I think is incredibly violent is that they're excluding people diagnosed with celiac or IBS. So they're saying, yeah, they're saying if you have celiac or you have inflammatory bowel disease, you do not have a functional GI disorder. Those kids that have been diagnosed with that, they do not have a functional GI disorder that would count towards a core comorbidity for these HSD subtypes.
So, wow. So they're saying psychosomatic mechanisms are the only ones that count as mechanisms of comorbidities in children.
yes, that inference could be made because that's the kind of data on mechanism that they like, is that psychosomatic, that psychological mechanism for a physiological symptom in what they call the absence of a physical mechanism, just ignoring the physical mechanisms that could be present, such as a gluten sensitivity or things diagnosed as inflammatory bowel disease that are just mast cell.
Right.
Um, and if you're ruling people like that out, you need to think about who you're ruling out, because the people who have access to diagnoses like mast cell or diagnoses that might fit within what they're considering functional outside of psychosomatic things, those are the privileged people. Those are the white affluent patients. People, kids who have really, really impactful GI stuff and are in a different social situation. Maybe they're impoverished, maybe they're people of color, maybe they're both, maybe they're trans kids. They're much more likely to get that irritable bowel syndrome diagnosis, and then they won't in their future get any EDS diagnoses.
Also, like the idea that everyone thinks that irritable bowel syndrome or disorder is not a functional GI disorder, like that's actually like not decided within that community. Like there are people in both camps. So even trying to separate those, like that is controversial from like that specific area of research without EDS involvement, even though they're not even looking for that. And then like if you're excluding people who like, I mean, they're basically completely ignoring mast cell.
Yeah.
Like, which is, how does that make you feel, Anne Maitland? But Theoretes is pissed. But that's really dangerous, especially with COVID and the fact that COVID is a mast cell virus and the ways that people's conditions and experiences are worsening or spiraling from a COVID infection. You know, that's really related to mast cell in relation to the connective tissue differences, like because mast cells are a type of connective tissue.
Yeah, and we've got to look at the agenda again, because because those things are increasing with long COVID, because there is some good research out there talking about connective tissue and mast cells and fibroblasts and all that stuff that actually lends itself to explaining mechanism. Denying all of that absolves them of the responsibility of caring for an ever-growing, very, very common population, and, you know, recommending guidelines that would help people care for that population.
Here's my stance. If they don't want to do this anymore, no, I'm serious. Like, if you can't handle what the hole that you have dug yourself, you can leave. You know, it's
well, I think they're going to. And this was my original guess when they did the 2017 is okay, you're just going to cut out everybody but this tiny subset of the hypermobile EDS population because you think
not
you
even
can find some factors. Yeah, not based in data, but maybe there's data now and they're making some of these decisions off of that.
It'd be hilarious if like genetics were never really confirmed. It just would be fun.
I mean, it would, but working from the assumption that many people are guessing right now that they are going to find some genetic factors for certain types of hypermobile EDS, they are actually setting themselves up to bow out. They're setting themselves up to find the last genetic factors for the last type of EDS and cut out all other types of common hypermobile disability from the EDS category and leave them in this psychosomatic category and this, you know, musculoskeletal only category.
Based in diagnostic features that don't correlate to shit. Like
Sure.
the ones that specifically don't. I mean, it's, yeah.
Yeah. And certainly not quality of life, like markanoid habitus, pythogenic papules. These have nothing to do with how disabled people are by their hypermobile condition, and by what they call these comorbidities, the manifestations of their hypermobile conditions. So, you know, let's not even bother with anxiety. They're saying it's correlated. Of course, it's correlated. There's
The
lots of,
p-value is 0.035. I'm sorry, that is not enough.
not good enough. Yeah, and
No,
that is Bulbana. Look at that. Um,
not good enough.
yeah. This is all, and
It
now we get to emerging comorbidities. So,
Well, go to dysautonomia first. Was there anything in dysautonomia?
oh, I don't think that I noted. Let me check. Um, this quote might have been from dysautonomia. There is weak to very weak evidence for possible mechanistic links with local connective tissue, anatomical, and physiological abnormalities.
Oh,
Where is
what?
that? I can find it. Very weak. I mean, it's just them ignoring data again. It's at the bottom of functional gastrointestinal. Okay, so we already passed that. Let's see.
I mean, basically, one thing they say is that, like, if someone has an hEDS or HSD diagnosis and POTS, like, their situations are worse than people without hypermobility. So they're basically saying hEDS and HSD just means they have hypermobility, which is not the only thing that's required in that diagnosis. So F off. And then, I mean, they're not assessing anyone for orthostatic symptoms. I'm going to scroll up, which they should be. But they're basically saying that, yeah, like, there's more disability associated with orthostatic intolerance, which is like, yeah, of course. But then, we go back to the fact that the core comorbidities are not actually required for diagnosis.
Right.
Scroll down.
Yeah. And this is, I want to talk about the emerging comorbidities.
Okay.
So they say, I think not where we're pointed right now, but the 10% cutoff they use to include the core comorbidities. They say in emerging comorbidities that they're low frequency, less than 10%, and the evidence is weak or too weak, and that's why they didn't include these things as core. And this is table 3 listing some of those emerging comorbidities as they're calling them. And the one that I really want to point out, just as an example of how much they're lying, is autism spectrum disorder. They're citing the research they want to cite. They are not citing the major, very thorough research on hypermobility, neurodivergence, chronic pain, and dysautonomia that's come out by Chech and cohorts in the last few years. So there's actually very solid evidence, statistics showing that people who are autistic people are 7 times more likely to have hypermobility and have the presence of pain and dysautonomia. So saying that this doesn't meet a cutoff, they can only say that because they're ignoring that research and that data. And when we think about autistic kids and we think about how they're characterizing hypermobility and anxiety and not taking the lived experience and report of symptoms of the actual experiencer seriously, this becomes all the more violent. So that's a really acute example of what they're doing here and what they're ignoring. Of course, there are other things mentioned here that are part of the connective tissue spectrum, but the autism piece is just like, it's a straight up lie. They can't not be aware of that research. They chose not to cite it because the numbers, I don't know.
No, I agree. I mean, they chose not to. Oh no. Sorry, I just got a text. They chose not to cite more recent data that is really good associating these things. I also think that, within the hypermobile community, there's people who maybe don't want to acknowledge their neurodivergence as autism, because of their internalized ableism. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's a part of, not being interested in including the more recent studies that really do show this connection.
Yeah.
So Elle and I were talking about is like, well, two things. One, there's a big conversation in kind of the autism and chronic pain communities about, you know, how a lot of people who are gendered as boys are usually diagnosed with ASD versus people who are gendered as girls are diagnosed with anxiety or chronic pain or that kind of thing. So we know there's an overrepresentation of folks in those different diagnostic categories. So it's just, you know, they're just enabling and repeating all of the stuff that everyone's like, that's bad, at this point.
Yeah.
In other communities, essentially.
Yeah, and really, really setting things up for that psychiatrization Audrey was talking about, and we've been talking about, really setting that common hypermobility, especially in more oppressed populations, up to be characterized as psychiatric, for them to have psychosomatic pain and all these mental health diagnoses that in adolescence, especially, and autistic folks usually turn into things like bipolar, borderline, all these different things that can expose people to incredibly harmful treatments and a lot of coercion, and deny them any care for, you know, their GI issues, their dysautonomia, and their pain, because their pain is just going to be seen as a manifestation of that psychological stuff rather than this systemic symptomatic thing. Anyway.
Other comorbidities they name and likely also cherry pick data from is inflammatory arthritis, developmental coordination disorder, or DCD, which has been something that's been associated with hypermobility for a long time.
Their proprioception is just out of whack.
Right. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Then they have autism spectrum disorder, and then they have
menorrhagia and dysmenorrhea. That's going to be, issues with menstruation, which have been very neglected in EDS research. I wonder why. Yeah.
And they won't like, it's like, what about PCOS? Like, what about
endometriosis?
Endometriosis, right? Like, what about all these other things that come with this stuff that are really, really common and show up together? And
yeah. And then adolescent idiopathic scoliosis. It's just such a random inclusion. It's just, of course, scoliosis shows up, but of course they're going to use this really specific, you know, adolescent term. Anyway, those are some of the emerging comorbidities that they're not actually going to really include. If you scroll down, what do we have there? Some discussion, right? Oh, right. No, this is just them giving us some abbreviations. We can pull a couple of really funny ones. We've got that pediatric joint hypermobility, which is PGJH, pediatric generalized joint hypermobility, PGGJH, and then some things that we're more familiar with, like that. And of course, in acknowledgements, they have to thank the Ehlers-Danlos Society themselves, give themselves a pat on the back.
For their administrative coordination of the groups. So let's be real about who actually is making the decisions in the EDS Society for once. Don't separate this consortium from the EDS Society. Like, It's really
and they also thank Rodney Graham for his support of the working group and lifetime of tireless commitment to this disorder. So this is a professional call out to someone who's actually done quite a bit of work trying to characterize common hypermobility, not as benign, but has not had the guts to stand up to the establishment. And then we just think it's funny to note that in availability of data and materials, they say data sharing is not applicable to this article as no data sets were generated or analyzed during the current study. No shit, clearly.
Yeah, and you know, the process was led by Tofts, which is the first person the first author noted. the work edited specifically by Hakim. So that kind of gives you a hierarchy from one side to the other of folks, and who's doing the majority of the work, but who's kind of calling the shots.
Right.
And I think they say that, you know, there were no conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
So they say, you know, the authors declare they have no competing interests, which.
Well, that's the way of saying it. They don't really have competing interests because they're all working for the same agenda, but
doing the same thing.
yeah. And I actually,
Oh, I said, because they're the same people. They're just the same people.
Yeah, they're all in one pot there. There is one line that I think we can end with from the conclusion that I want to pull back to. So if you scroll up again, let me find it. Yes. That last sentence there, prospective cohort studies of the evolution of this phenotype and its relationship with adult hEDS would be of particular interest. So they're saying all this stuff. They're going through a conclusion. They're saying they presented this great framework, blah, 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 blah. And then they're, of course, saying that what they really want is further genetic research into this narrowed down phenotype that they think will be adult hEDS. And that's it. That's the whole point.
They've seen 5,000 patients combined.
Yeah.
You know, like an average patient load for a physician in New York City is 3,000. So 5,000 isn't super impressive to me, to be completely honest. And is not even the number of some of these prevalence studies that they cite that say, you know, this was a small sample size. So it's disappointing.
That's an understatement.
Yeah. They say this is a key resource for clinicians and researchers to ensure consistency in diagnosis. And I just have to say to them, if that is your goal, you are absolutely doing the opposite. Like,
I mean, it will ensure consistency of underdiagnosis and misdiagnosis.
It will ensure consistency in diagnosis for the people who are on this paper. And that's kind of it. You know, they contradict themselves multiple times. They cherry pick data, they warp data, they ignore it. And it's just a really good example of how nepotism kind of runs it. I'm going to scroll all the way back up, if that's okay. Or maybe I'll stop sharing for when we do our final remarks.
Stop sharing.
So maybe there's a new hEDS class of reclassification coming out. Who knows? This could be indicative of that. This could not be. They say it's aimed to complement the 2017 criteria. So maybe that's all that they're doing is complementing, although it's a difficult complement to understand.
And there's you know, things they're adding back in, like Marfanoid habitus. They really may be privy to information that the community at large is not, and making decisions based on what they think is going to happen with genetic research and hypermobile EDS, segmenting things further, cutting more and more out.
Those who actually have disabling experiences.
Yes.
Unless as a child, you're like, I mean, that's the part too that I think is really hard to understand, is like why children have to get to that kind of trauma to be considered, especially at a really young age. Like, it feels really harmful. I mean, it's harmful at all of the ages before biological maturity. Of what they call, you know, not adult but like as it gets younger, it feels just more severe and horrific. And you know, if you have a child who is in the NICU for recurring hernias, like that's all the money you have. You're going to be in debt. And then you expect someone to go through 15 different specialists or 15 different diagnostic procedures. You know, it just,
Well, and that's the thing. I don't think they do expect that. There may be some naive people on the authorship of this paper who really their glasses are rose colored enough that they do expect that. But you know, Hakeem knows better than that. Tinkle knows better than that. They know that that's not actually what's going to happen.
well, and let's be real, they're trying to find a gene based on race. They are trying to find the white genes.
Yeah, the tall, thin, white
Marfanoid,
hype. Yeah.
white, thin, right? You already said thin. People who, it's just like, wow.
But I promise you all that if I end up having that genetic factor for hypermobile EDS, I will not be abandoning you. Fuck the society. And it's the majority of hypermobile people and the diversity within that we should be concerned about, and the kids that are going to be hurt and even killed by these recommendations.
And
So this is
families are going to have to navigate that. I mean, this is going to be hugely distressing for families.
mhm,
It's really exciting.
yeah. And thinking of people who have finally gotten their hEDS diagnosis in adulthood and wanted things to be different for their children, and now will have no recourse to get them care.
And, you know, but I thought the EDS Society wanted to decrease the number of years that somebody was misdiagnosed.
By just never diagnosing them ever.
Or, you know, if the average is 20 years, 18, we're decreasing it by 2. I mean, it's just a slap in the face. I mean, it's really like, oh, and you think this is going to support early intervention? What are you talking about? I mean, and for a parent to have to, and all of these people who have now been kicked off of Medicaid because the pandemic emergency plan has ended and they're cutting benefit. I mean, it's just.
Yeah. Well, again, those aren't the hypes that they care about. Those are the hypes that they are creating this lie of it being benign. Now they're calling it asymptomatic, it being anxiety, blah, 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 blah.
I mean, it's literally taking us back.
As every reclassification has. That's what they like to do. They like, people do other research outside of this insular group, and then they do another reclassification that narrows things down further for this common hypermobility.
They're like, that's my patient pool. And it's like, why can't you just share? Why can't you realize that your agenda and your life and your lived experience is not the only one? And maybe if you really wanted to better humankind, I mean, we could make a lot of jokes, but I mean, this doesn't surprise me. I know it doesn't surprise you. You predicted this when the 2017 reclassification came out.
And I wish I was wrong, but
I know. I mean, I do too. And then the EDS Society is kind of like public performance of racial inclusion, just posting photos of Black people who are hypermobile. And then these are the decisions you're making to find the white gene. I mean, it's just like, it's like eugenic. What is it called? The race-based sciences. Wasn't there like an older term for it before it was said to exist anymore, even though it still does exist in full number.
I'm blanking on it.
But like if you're not including who this majority impacts, I don't know what you're looking for anymore, other than whiteness. You're looking for a version of whiteness that has suffered, and, deserves care. So
I don't know, you might be thinking of racial hygiene.
maybe that is what I'm thinking of.
No.
I don't know. I thought there was like a ology word.
Ology.
But it's okay. I could also be making it up.
I mean, it's all eugenics. They love to make up words, those eugenicists, and they're still doing it now.
HSD.
PG. They love
Yeah.
that. What they'd love even more is to be able to name something after themselves,
Yeah, they do. And whoever is listening to this may totally disagree with our interpretation, but it is in line with what we see on the ground daily. Like, I understand there's probably like an instinct or like a want to like go to the EDS society and ask these like ethical questions and like, have a diplomatic conversation. And I just want to remind everyone that they have had decades to have a diplomatic conversation, and they have not. And they will not, clean up their mess unless they're called out in a certain way that then they kind of also punish and erase as happening, but then try and perform this new kind of like activism or whatever to try and show that they care about these things. Like, people tell you who they are, and making the EDS society better is like, I mean, it is just going into a nonprofit charity organization thinking that like there's capacity to change the way things are viewed, even though these people's entire lives are tied into these narratives that are absolutely fake and made up and not actually following data that they didn't create. And so, I guess we don't really see a point in helping them be better. Like, that's their choice. They make that decision on their own time. It's unfortunate that they're one of the main resources that exists. That's the unfortunate piece.
Yeah.
And the value they have.
And as we're always saying, we need disabled hypermobile leadership. We need to get away from this eugenic ethos. And like when Audrey says they've had decades to do that, maybe the society themselves as an entity hasn't technically existed that long, but the entities that merged to make them and the people who have been on all of these reclassifications, making these decisions about the entire community, that has existed. And yeah, you would have to, you can't get in there and make them change their entire agenda and their genetic, I started saying genetics too soon. Their agenda when it comes down to it is eugenics. It's genetic research. It's that goal of the cure. And I know that a lot of hypermobile people out there, you're suffering so much. You're so neglected in medical settings. You have not had the resources you need. That cure feels like an answer. And I think we need to think about data when we talk about a cure. What does that actually mean when about 20% or more of the population is on this spectrum experiencing these experiences? The only types of genetic cures we have are eliminating genetic traits through how they do in vitro fertilization in embryos. They talk about genetic therapies, and those do not exist in real or accessible ways yet. And if they did, what other traits would they be eliminating along with them when we look at the overlap with neurodivergence, when we look at how everyone's an artist? Like, it's too many people to eliminate without eliminating so much wonderfulness. It's that idea that disability is inherently bad. We need to challenge that. And they're not going to do that. They're going to keep thinking of these things as tragic rare anomalies that can be narrowed down and eventually eliminated, even if they're using different language. And acknowledging that commonness is just going to conflict with that narrative and that goal. So they're never going to do that. Or they're going to acknowledge it as this asymptomatic thing that is not actually within their responsibility to address.
Yeah, even though they kind of screwed with everyone for a long time. I mean, you know,
I mean, they're still going to try to get people's money when it comes to, conferences and resources. And I don't know quite what they're going to do if genetic factors are identified with the kind of HSD pool. I think that was kind of foresight rebranding, and they probably will keep trying to run research and education for what they consider non-syndromic hypermobile conditions. But the care impact that's not their goal, and it's never going to be.
Well, and I think they're making I mean, there are many reasons why this choice is a grave error. But with long COVID, impacts to connective tissue and permeability of tissues, particular connective tissue, because that's where permeability often increases or decreases. There's going to be a lot of new variations. There's going to be a lot more complexity, and it's already happening. And they're finally acknowledging that there's an association of long COVID with, hypermobile EDS and HSD because Hakeem is doing the research, not because anyone else already did it. This stuff has already been published in Nature as like observations of pools of people. I mean, long COVID populations, I mean, that's some of the most population data of a specific diagnosis coming out so quickly that's happened in years. Like, there's so much information, and just the willingness to not include any of those factors unless they are the ones publishing it or leading it or directing it or moderating it or narrating it. It's almost like you're not up for a challenge, like, be challenged by the world. I don't know. Like, it's it's cowardly in a lot of ways. It's really cowardly. And like, you took this on. So, but of course we have higher expectations for people than maybe they chose themselves. Yeah. And we know this is like terrible news. We wish we could bring better news to folks. I mean, really, it's usually bad news after bad news, and slight recoveries in between. But, reevaluate your alliances to people. Like, think about who is complicit in this. Like, this is not something that only affects you, that only affects the subtype with this genetic thing. Like, we are talking about billions of people, like billions. So, as Mariama Kaba says, let this radicalize you, because the more you try, the more you're going to find out how it's not going to work that way. There is no repair to this situation at this point by the people who are making the choices. So,
yeah, I mean, the repair would be for them to disband, probably, yeah, and stop dictating these things for the entire community.
And that's how a lot of research is, right? Like, this kind of hypermobile world is a microcosm of kind of the larger stuff, but there are very specific connections this has to very mainstream, very high-powered parts of medicine, some of the most high-powered medical players in the world, including Peter H. Baden, who recently passed away. We are not too remorse about that one. So, yeah, it's a particularly slimy version of what happens, and it's highly impactful because of the long history of the way that people have been treated. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
But it is not, don't let this lead you to defeat, like the quote Audrey was getting at. What this means, I mean, grief, yeah, we gotta grieve this. And all the families that are never gonna get the information they need. But I think what this means to us is just more and more. We've got to challenge these things and talk about them and build our own knowledge bases and share our own knowledge bases, because where the actual, ideas about mechanism and hypermobile disability, connective tissue come from. There's some good research out there. There is the community who's known these things for so long. And that's really what should be guiding whatever diagnostic frameworks we use. We've really got to.
And the way that science should be done. Like, this is an opportunity to redesign systems. I'm not kidding. And no one is willing to even remotely criticize. And it's like,
Right.
Hold on,
Yeah.
like, so.
Yeah. And just imagine if medical care was actually based in listening to the person's experience and prioritizing their quality of life rather than this so-called objective measurement stuff, continuing to use the Baton when it doesn't work, continuing to stretch people's skin. Just imagine if the actual real data, people's experiences, was actually held in the highest regard.
Right. Well, we are building toward that. So, we hope to be on the other side. We were blacklisted a long time ago from the EDS Society. So you can we'll take the heat, and yeah, please share this around. We know it's really long. We wanted to be really comprehensive because it's just abhorrent, and you should know. The more you dig with a lot of this stuff, the more you uncover. So if you find yourself going into some rabbit holes, feel free to share what you find. We love looking at those things when we have time. And also know that, like, this paper was really secretly released. And so a lot of pediatrics probably don't know about it. And a lot of people who do diagnose may not. So just don't say anything at first. Like, let them bring it up, because this wasn't widely circulated whatsoever. Who knows what their dissemination plan is? Everything is always chaotic over there. And use that to your advantage, like, get the diagnosis while you can, if you can, continue pursuing things if you have capacity. And also, like, remember that it's okay to pause and not engage with the medical system if you feel like you just can't, because that's very real. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cheers, y'all. All right. That
Hope you
was, hope you
no,
do
go for it.
something. I was going to say that was pediatric joint hypermobility, a diagnostic framework and narrative review.
That was it.
Oh.
And we will also have linked to this video, our document of all of the citations that they cite, and the paper itself, so you can read it yourself if you want. And I was gonna say, do something nice for yourself after this. Do you listen to this?
Yeah, for your family. Yeah. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.